Guys, welcome back to the automation tips series where I am explaining to you a bunch of really useful automation tips you can apply to your AI agents and workflows and not only make it much easier for you to automate different tasks, no matter how complicated they may be, but also make them much more reliable so you don't have to constantly babysit some hallucinatory AI agent that keeps breaking your JSON output or whatever. This is probably tip 3 or 4 of the series. I don't know. I lost count. I've been recording all of these in one go. I don't know. This is probably tip 3 or 4. And the tip is reliable is better than fancy automations. Now, let me explain. Modern AI models like LLMs are getting a lot of hype. Everyone wants an AI agent. Almost nobody actually needs an AI agent. I've automated some really complicated tasks, not just for myself, but for different various business clients as well. And let me tell you, almost none of them have needed an AI agent. In fact, even I myself have not needed an AI agent for a very long time. I built a ton of automations. I'm using LLMs in these automations, but I don't need an agent architecture at all. Why? Because most of my automations have deterministic elements, right? And I'm going to explain what that means, and I'm going to explain how my automations are so much more reliable than 99% of the ones you see on Twitter, on YouTube, on all of these other people that are advertising their fancy agents that work some of the time, not all of the time. Here's the big problem with LLMs, right? LLMs are hallucinatory, meaning they hallucinate bad output. They need constant babysitting because they hallucinate bad output. So you always need a human to review the LLM's output to make sure it's not, producing something completely garbage. And because of both of those things, they are unreliable. You can't have an LLM running autonomously, making decisions, making changes in your systems and processes without having some sort of a human review step to make sure that everything is proceeding nicely and the LLM is not, spouting garbage. And if that wasn't enough, these LLM tokens are extremely expensive as well, which is a huge problem, right? I've made videos on token maxing before, all of these different companies burning millions and millions of dollars on LLM tokens that accomplish nothing. Meta has burned almost $900 million last I checked. Uber burned like, I don't know, 3-4 billion with a B, right? $1 billion in just 4 months. So having all these LLMs doing all of these fancy tasks for us is just the wrong approach, right? Not only is it really expensive and completely unnecessary, it hallucinates, it needs babysitting, it's unreliable, it's not something you can deploy on your machine and just let it run behind the scenes. It's something that needs constant babysitting and costs you millions of dollars. At that point, why not just do it yourself, right? So this is not the right approach in most cases. Now, LLMs do have their own benefits. When it comes to reasoning tasks, right? When you need to understand natural language, when you need to reason about things, when you need to, do the reasoning kind of complex tasks, LLMs shine, right? This is where they are actually really useful. But a lot of reasoning, like you'd be surprised over here, a lot of reasoning tasks can be done with traditional code. Why? Because in my experience, when people describe a reasoning task to me, it is such a simple process that you could easily do it in a bunch of if-else statements. You wouldn't even need LLM reasoning because the reasoning involved is so simple, and most automations are like that. I'm not saying all of them are like this, but most of them are like this. And for the really complicated reasoning tasks, sure, you could use an LLM, but you'd be surprised how many of your reasoning tasks are just simple if-else statements in disguise, right? Like, don't forget, even before LLMs came out, we still had things like, I don't know, Siri in Apple and iOS, right? And Google Assistant in Android devices. And even before LLMs came out, these things were so friggin' smart, right? You would think that they're using some sort of complicated AI, but really it's just traditional code. So you'd be surprised how far you can get in what you would consider reasoning tasks, but really it's just a bunch of if-else statements, it's a bunch of traditional code, it's a bunch of deterministic operations that you're doing. And doing it this way is a lot more reliable than doing it with LLMs. So I'm not saying that LLMs are bad or that you can't use them at all. I'm saying they have their special place in an automation process alongside traditional code. The problem is that most new developers and most businesses and non-technical people, they don't understand just how much power there is in traditional code and automation tools before LLMs. So they're trying to do things with LLMs that traditional code can already do way cheaper, way more reliably, and way faster. So with all of that being said, here is the big meta. Here is the best way to create reliable automations that run fast. They're cheap to run. You can run them 100 times a day and still not cost even $1,000 in LLM tokens. The first thing you need to do, write down the entire process step by step so you understand all of it in really granular, really precise detail. Because if you don't write it down, you won't understand it. If you don't understand each step, you won't be able to automate it. Step 2, don't try to build an AI agent. In 99% of the cases, you won't need an AI agent. What you need is a deterministic automation. By the way, when I say deterministic, it means that the automation is guaranteed to run the exact same way, no matter how many times you run it, no matter when you run it, right? Basically, if I run 2 plus 2, it always needs to give me 4, right? If you use traditional code, it's always going to give you 4. If you use LLMs, it might give you 4. It might give you 4 in double quotes. It might give you the letters FOUR instead of the number 4. Like, it's going to give you all kinds of different output, right? For the exact same prompt again and again. So it's not reliable. It's not deterministic. So don't try to build an AI agent. Like I said, 99% of people don't need one. Build a deterministic automation that only uses LLMs when reasoning is required, right? You can send an API call to OpenAI and Anthropic. You can send an API call to whatever LLM provider you're using. You can pass in the prompts. You can get the output from there without having to build an AI agent, right? So build a reliable deterministic automation filled with as much deterministic code as you can. That's going to make it really reliable. And in the really rare cases where you need reasoning, send an API call to the LLM, let it do the reasoning, grab the response, clean it up, and then use that in your automation pipeline. Now, step 3, because step 2 sounds like a lot of work, step 3 is to use a coding agent to write all of this code for you. This is going to make you 100 times faster. Nobody's asking you to write all of this deterministic code for your automation by hand, right? We don't do that anymore. Use an AI agent, use Cursor, Claude Code, Codex, whatever you want to use. I've been having really great results with Claude Code and Codex right nowadays. And if you asked me which model to pick, I would just go with Codex and the latest models that they have over there. But use a coding agent, use it to build the automation that you're trying to build, all right? Write the code for it. Now, step 4 is to add as much determinism as you possibly can into this whole automation pipeline, right? Meaning Python code, TypeScript code, Bash code, traditional code that is guaranteed to run the exact same way no matter how many times you run it. You're only going to invoke an LLM when you need the actual reasoning, when you need the complex reasoning that a large language model offers you. But for every other step, you're going to just fill it with as much determinism as you possibly can. I was going to say determination, but fill it with as much determinism as you possibly can. That's going to make your automations way more reliable. Now, a little caveat that you should probably know. In many cases, you don't necessarily know the full steps of the automation pipeline beforehand, so you can't figure out what steps to make deterministic and which steps are better off in the hands of an LLM or an agent, right? In those cases, feel free to use an LLM for those vague parts of the workflow, but once you run it a few times, you're probably going to notice that a lot of the work that the LLM is doing, you could probably capture it in a deterministic fashion, right? And so that's where the iteration or the feedback loop comes in, right? As you keep finding more and more ways to add deterministic code to the entire automation, you'll keep updating this automation process and keep adding more deterministic code to it until you're satisfied with the reliability score, right? And reliability score is just a fancy way of saying until you're satisfied with the reliability that this automation offers, right? A good example of this is, let's say, browser automation, right? And I'm going with this one because it's super popular. A lot of people are trying to do it, and a lot of people are doing it, I would say, wrong. Like, they're doing it in a wrong and inefficient way. So let me explain. Most people, when they're trying to automate a task on their browser, what they're going to do is they're just going to hand over control of their browser to Claude, right? They're going to give Claude a browser and just ask it to do the task and just let it run, right? Now, nothing wrong with this, right? When you're trying to automate a browser task for the first time, you probably don't know the exact workflow, right? And so using Claude to do this for you is completely fine. It's actually a really great way to figure out the exact workflow, right? But then once you've done that, and once you know the exact steps involved, you need to add determinism to it. You can't just run Claude 100 times to do the exact same task again and again. That's a waste of LLM tokens. It's going to cost you a lot of money. and it's unreliable and it needs constant babysitting. Why? Because we've already discussed somewhere over here, right here, that LLMs are unreliable, right? So here's what you do. Once you figured out the workflow using Claude, right? You gave Claude access to your browser and it executed the task perfectly, right? Now that you know exactly what the workflow is like, you can add deterministic steps to it. And the way you add determinism to browser automation is by using something like Playwright or Puppeteer. I use Playwright, which is a browser automation tool, right? And Playwright can grab an HTML page, scan its HTML, CSS, etc., and find the buttons it needs to click and all that, right? Once you figure out the workflow that you're trying to do with Claude, you can just ask it to write the entire automation in Playwright. And then you'll be using traditional code, deterministic code, to run the automation again and again, right? And that is such a better approach than having Claude run the entire thing manually again and again, right? So a bit of a real world example over here. I do a lot of web scraping, right? I've got a bunch of websites and platforms where I scrape a ton of data from, right? Because I'm too lazy to go in there and grab thousands of records by hand. I've got automations that do it for me. And I need to run these automations regularly, every day, every couple of days, maybe every week. If I ask Claude to do this for me once, that's one thing, right? I'm just trying to figure out the workflow. If I then ask it to run this every single day and grab thousands of records for me, I'm going to be paying huge bills in LLMs. I'm going to be paying Anthropic millions of dollars, which I don't have yet. All right, I'm still working on that. So this would be a horrible way to do this, right? But if I just ask Claude to write a Playwright automation for me in simple Python code that I can then run hundreds of times, thousands of times, and it costs me $0 after that, that's the right approach, right? And now here's an even better example, right? I'm using deterministic code to scrape all of this data, but what if I want to analyze it using an agent later, right? Well, I can keep the web scraping part completely deterministic, grab all of the data, save it in some JSON file or some database, and then I can have an agent analyze it there in the database or in the JSON file. I don't need an agent to scrape the data itself, right? So I'm still making as much of this whole process deterministic as much as possible, and reducing the reliance on LLMs and non-deterministic and unreliable tools, right? And that's the big lesson over here. You want to add as much determinism as you possibly can into your automation. That's going to reduce your reliance on these unreliable and expensive LLMs, which are still very useful in reasoning tasks. Don't get me wrong. I don't want this to be a video where I'm just bashing on LLMs. They are extremely useful. I'm using them every day. I'm using them in so many different cases. But they have a place, right? They have a place in the automation pipeline. And that's when it comes to high, complex reasoning tasks. So that's the big lesson. Add as much determinism as you can into your automations. Use traditional code wherever possible. And just reduce the reliance that you have on LLMs, right? And if you do all of these things, your automations are going to be way more reliable. They're going to run correctly way more times. And depending on how well you do this, you could probably run the exact same automation 1,000 times a day, which you probably don't need to do, but you could, without costing hundreds of thousands of dollars in LLM tokens. So, hope that helps. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and you can get this kind of quality content every single day, every 2 days. I don't know. I don't have an upload schedule, but I upload pretty frequently. So subscribe, turn on the bell icon, and make sure you don't miss another video.